Particular video has to do with affluence as far as black people are concerned, and more so to do with housing and where people live. I've lived in a lot of places throughout my life. I've lived in some super poor neighborhoods. I've lived in some well-to-do neighborhoods. I've lived in apartments. I've lived in houses. I've lived in black neighborhoods. I've lived in Hispanic neighborhoods. I can't honestly say I've lived in primarily white neighborhoods. I have to make that caveat. I have lived in really mixed neighborhoods where we had a nice mixture of white people, black people, Hispanic people, and Asian people. And that, honestly, I think that was pretty much the second best neighborhood that I lived in. Now, my current housing situation, I think, is probably the best. It is really nice where I live, and it is, I would say, primarily a black neighborhood with a sprinkling of some Asians, and we do have like one white family here. Anyway, this segment has to do with black people and white people living together or being segregated. I'm going to play this particular clip, and hopefully it'll give you some information as to the outlook of people as they become more economically affluent, and what their potential options and decisions are as far as where they live.
When it comes to race and housing, the conventional wisdom is that African Americans gain more wealth. They generally move to richer, whiter neighborhoods. The New York Times upended that belief with a recent article entitled "Affluent, Black and Still Trapped by Segregation, Why Well-Off Black Families End Up Living in Poor Areas Than White Families with Similar or Lower Incomes." Look at these numbers. Among African Americans and whites across the U.S. who earn $100,000 a year or more, 37% of blacks live in poor areas, while just 9% of whites do. In the city of Milwaukee, the numbers are even more stark. 59% of African Americans making $100,000 or more live in poor areas, compared to just 6% of whites. Joining us via FaceTime from Kansas City, Missouri, to break it all down, the co-writers of the New York Times article, John Elegant, a national correspondent for the Times who covers race issues, and still with us, of course, Paris Chenard, Tiffany Lofton, Dr. Cleo Monago. So, John, the thing is here, if you want to understand race in America, you follow housing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, there's two things at play here. One thing you have to look at is, for generations, this country intentionally and purposely segregated people by race. As you well know, black people for generations were not allowed to buy certain housing stock in certain areas. So what you've created is this dynamic where today you have a lot of these communities where white people grew up only around white people, black people only grew up around black people. So a lot of people that I talk to there, a lot of the professional black families talk about, once they quote unquote make it, even at that point, they go into, white communities. It's not that people throwing eggs at them or anything like that, or they feel this overt hostility, but they feel a sense of otherness. There's one family I talked to that did live in a predominantly white suburb at one point, and the father talked about being pulled over by the cops several times. They talk about not knowing their neighbors. They talk about going out and pushing his daughter on her bicycle and having a neighbor bring her kids in as they were going by. So it's really this sense of otherness that's been created. But I think, one important thing to understand as well, Roland, is that these housing policies that kept blacks and whites separate for so long, not only is it a social thing, but it's also an economic thing. So while you may have black families who make high income nowadays, what black families did not have access to over these generations was wealth that they could pass down through housing to their following generations. So now you may have some families that, they have pretty good income, but they don't have the generational wealth built up. And without that generational wealth, it makes it hard to buy into some of these more high-income, affluent areas.
Also, it's also safe to say that one of the reasons African Americans are remaining in those areas as well is because they might feel uncomfortable being in those neighborhoods where they don't feel welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's definitely this sense of discomfort and whatnot when you grow up, around people who you identify with, who you have these deep cultural connections with. You can really relate to them. But then you might go out to a white suburb or something like that, and you just don't feel that connection. You don't feel that comfort there around the people. There's not that warm embrace that a lot of them feel. So I think that definitely plays a part of it.
One of the things I want to go to panel here. I mean, look, the bottom line is here, and I keep making this point. The reality is housing is used in America to separate races. Folks want to act as if that's not true, but that has been American history, and it continues today. Is it as overt as before? No, but it still continues today.
Well, I, at the risk of sounding controversial, think it's good when black people stay in black neighborhoods. I think it's good when there's a cross-section of economic capacity in black neighborhoods so we can rebuild black communities and bring wealth back to where black people live. And I think it's problematic when black people up and go to live with white folks and volunteer to be in a hostile environment and having confused children who go from black to black. That's kind of an inside thing between her and I.
Black.
But who get confused in terms of self-concept because it's surrounded by white folks, and when they move away from blacks, it implies that the black people are not as good as whites, and it's all these psychological side effects of that uprooting. So I don't like racism or redlining and the context that will lead to black people not being able to move like they want to move around.
Right.
But that's a whole other topic. I think it's good when black people are together and show each other what wealth looks like so we can all have prosperity.
Well, clearly, I don't think there's any problem with a person wanting to move to a different neighborhood or go to a place to have a safer or better school district. So I don't think
Safer.
Claire's not that safe.
Where are the unsafe schools? Where are the unsafe schools?
I'm saying if a person wants to move out of a community that might be unsafe at the time for them, and move to a safer neighborhood, move to a neighborhood that has a better school district that might be white. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But what I will say that historically there was a time when in black neighborhoods you lived next to a doctor, a lawyer, and a sanitation worker. And I think that there was some benefit to that because young people saw the aspirational aspect of a black person being a lawyer, being a doctor, or someone that had a good paying job and that was working.
That's part of my point.
I'm saying there's facts that, but we shouldn't demonize the person that wants to move up.
Here's what I think. I think one, whether you want to live in a black neighborhood or white neighborhood, whatever it is, what we're seeing now, in contrast to what our buddy Ken said earlier with White Lives Matter, is that you're looking at the reports that just told us that 59% of those folks are black and 9% of them are white, and we're talking about wealth in this country, we're talking about where folks are able to live. The problem that we're seeing, which I know very well living now in Anacostia, Southeast in Washington, D.C., is that we do not have the same opportunities when you put all black folks together. That segregation is about opportunities, it's about food deserts, it's about lack of schools, not because the schools are unsafe and not because the schools are not white, because the schools don't get funding, because the schools do not have teachers who have the right programs, who have the right support, who have the right school supplies to be able to go. I did organizing in Jackson, Mississippi, Roland, and I knocked on doors and spoke with teachers in Jackson, Mississippi, who on the first day of school did not have supplies, and the schools were not ready because the students and the schools there did not have the proper funding that they needed. But white schools get everything.
John?
So let's talk about that.
John, final comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's important to note is that segregation, let's not make this an issue of black people have chosen segregation. Study after study has shown that white people actually prefer to live in predominantly white neighborhoods while black people prefer mixed neighborhoods. So let's look at, the structures that have created this system, and this is not something that's the fault of black people. And like your panelist said, they're totally right. There's nothing wrong with wanting to stay in a strong black neighborhood. The issue is resources. Very oftentimes there's a lot of poverty in these neighborhoods and people don't get the resources. The neighborhoods don't get the jobs, the economy, and the good schools that that their children deserve.
All right, John, we really appreciate it. Thank you so very much.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, folks, student debt is a...
All right, and resources as far as properly funded schools, etc., those more than anything else come from property taxes, okay? When you live in an area that where the property taxes revenue is low, obviously the schools aren't going to get a lot of money from that. when you live in an area where property taxes are high, and I'm not necessarily talking about the rate, I'm talking about the property taxes collected as a function of the value of the homes. Okay, so if you live in an area where the houses are averaging $50,000, and let's say the property tax is, let's say it's 2%. Okay, you're talking about $1,000 in property taxes. Okay, if you're living in an area, okay, and that's per home, 50,000, $1,000, XYZ number of homes. But now let's say you're living in an area where the houses are $150,000. Okay, that same property tax is going to generate $3,000 a year in property tax. Okay, multiplied out over the same number of homes, those schools are in a much better financial situation than the people that are with kids that are living in those $50,000 homes. So, it's a function of real estate values being either high or low, function of the amount of property tax. Long Island, I think they have like a 5% property tax in some areas on like $1 million homes. Okay, 5% on a $1 million home is $50,000 a year. There are people that don't even make half of that. So you could turn around and give them $1 million home on Long Island, and they couldn't afford to stay there because they couldn't pay the damn property tax. At the same time, you have property tax of like 1% in California based on a proposition that limited the amount of property tax that could be collected. And you have the opposite, that $1 million home, at your 1% property tax is $10,000. That you can afford to pay, basically. So anyway, I thought this was a pretty unique segment that provides information as far as segregation, where people live, why they choose to live where they live, and the resources that become available to people that live in one area versus another.